folks. All right. Thank you for coming back, and I do apologize in advance. There's going to be a delay tonight. Senator Sanders called me, and he said, please hold off on starting until all of the results from Iowa. Sorry.
Do we have that much time?
I'm coming. I'll be back. I'll be back tomorrow. I am from Iowa. I'm from a little railroad town in Iowa, and so I have some interesting feelings. But thinking of politics, and I'm not going to talk about politics, I promise. But it does give me a lot of good feeling that we're in a room full of people who value science. I know many people in this room are professional scientists and are retired scientists. But it's heartwarming for me, someone who's a quantitative ecologist who sits at a computer all day, writing computer code, develop mathematical models that describe how animal populations change. I write computer code all day. It's great to see people who actually are interested in science and use science and have a passion for science. And I often get asked by people what you can do for science. Oh, yeah, can someone, I didn't really realize the music is still off. Can we ask that at the desk to turn that? Would be great. Thank you. So I should say, if you don't know me, I'm Jason Hill, and I am the host of Suds and Science, and occasional presenter as well. I work for the Vermont Center of Eagle Studies. We are a local nonprofit just over the town line in White River Junction. And if you don't know anything about us, on the table out there, there's a brochure with a handsome-looking dude, 5 years younger, on the front cover, banding some birds somewhere. We do original research that directly informs conservation and management of animal populations. We put on Suds and Science as an opportunity for folks to get together and, yeah, to learn some stuff, but also to interact with other fans of science. That's what I like to say. It's heartwarming to me to know that there are people who support science, who thinks that science should be an important part of public policy and public life. And science is a tool, right? A tool that we can agree on to get at a common set of facts and a way to develop policies and develop ideas about how we should manage the outdoors through science. What a novel idea. Having said that, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker tonight from the Harris Center for Conservation Education, Science Director Brett Amy Thelen. And before I do that, I just wanted to say also that there are some stickers that we just had made out. I don't know if you like stickers. You put them on your guitar case when your band goes to jam at the bar. That's what I do with mine. They're on the table right out there, and there's a brochure here. David Mears and I, who's the Executive Director for Audubon Vermont, he and I are coordinating a panel discussion series about birds and climate change following a film later this month in Woodstock as part of the Woodstock Sustainability Initiative. There'll be a hosting of the film called The Messenger. It's about effects of climate change and other human-caused effects on bird populations. And then we'll be hosting the panel discussion afterwards. You can sit and ask questions, and if you're always something you didn't know about, but you wanted to know about, you're embarrassed to ask, that's a great time to come and ask.
What's the date?
It is the 25th at 6 p.m. Thank you, in the Woodstock Town Hall. And it's put on by Ascutney Mountain Audubon, and it's part of the Sustainable Woodstock film series. So please think about coming out. All this information is at the door. It is great to be back. I'm sorry to say next month is on Super Tuesday. So if you're voting, please vote and then come to Suds and Science. And without any, Kevin?
Yeah, he mentioned the stickers. We actually have two different styles of stickers. We're trying to get a better sense of which one people prefer.
Also vote,
two new ones.
take one and vote that way?
Take one and vote.
I didn't count them ahead of time.
Just tell me which one.
We will randomly sample them afterwards, and then I'll infer what the population size was before you started taking them.
Yeah, that's
Great. Without any further ado, my absolute pleasure, Brett Amy Thelen. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Brett. As Jason said, I'm the science director down at the Harris Center for Conservation Education. We're a nonprofit land trust and environmental education center based in the Monadnock region of southwest New Hampshire. So about an hour and a half just southeast of here. And in my role as science director with the Harris Center, one of the things I do is I coordinate our citizen science initiatives. I suspect you all are familiar with the concept of citizen science if you're fans of the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, because they're real leaders in that field. But for those of you who might be new to that idea, it's essentially, it's something that's an age-old practice with a new name, which is volunteer involvement in collecting scientific data. And for us, it's ecological data on a local or regional scale that has the potential to affect land conservation and ecological restoration projects and wildlife protection. And so tonight I wanted to share with you some stories from our longest running and by far most popular citizen science project, the Salamander Crossing Brigades. Which is focused on a lesser known, maybe not among this crowd, but a lesser known natural history phenomenon that happens every spring on the first warm, rainy nights of the year, which is the spring amphibian migration. So before I kind of dig into that, I do want to say that I'm hoping that you will chime in with questions and that this will be a bit of a conversation and that your interests and questions and curiosities will drive our conversation tonight. I have a few things I definitely want to share with you, but I'm really interested in hearing what you're interested in about this topic too. So please feel free to weigh in as we go. I was planning to share a little bit about the spring amphibian migration for those of you who might not know, and then the conservation issue that roadkill has become for these critters, what our project does to address that, and then some kind of what I think are inspiring outcomes of our project. And then I'll also, if there's time, share about a really cool side project that we started 5 years ago that everybody seems to find fascinating, looking at individual spotted salamanders and their spot patterns. But I'll get to that later. I do want to start, for anyone who might not be familiar with the spring amphibian migration, it's a truly magical time of year. The first warm, rainy nights, by warm I mean 40 degrees or above, after the ground has thawed, when thousands and thousands and thousands of salamanders and frogs migrate from the woodlands where they've spent the winter underground to vernal pools and other wetlands to breed. It's not a large migration in terms of distance. It's typically less than a quarter mile. But in our modern landscape, for many of them, this means crossing roads. And I should add that these species, primarily in early spring, we're talking about wood frogs, spring peepers, spotted salamanders. At a few sites, we have Jefferson salamanders. And then as it gets warmer, there's more and more critters out on the road, more and more species, some of whom are migrating to breeding pools like American toads and gray tree frogs, others who are just out and about dispersing, kind of stretching out after a long winter. But in the early spring, it's really just these few species, and they exhibit strong site fidelity to their breeding sites. That means a strong attachment to these sites. They return to them year after year. Spotted salamanders can live 20 to 30 years. So this is a long-term process for them. And so patterns emerge on the landscape of where these animals are moving and when they're moving. And usually when I ask people, when you think of roadkill, or road mortality, as they call it in the scientific literature, what species do you first think of? If I say roadkill, what do you think about?
Porcupine.
Porcupines, deer, squirrels. So mostly we think about mammals that have kind of large bodies, so their carcasses stay by the side of the road for a while for us to see them. And we tend to think of roadkill as a one-at-a-time phenomenon. There's a deer here or there, or a porcupine. There's a growing body of literature around road mortality, and what it's saying is, while it is significant for certain mammal populations, especially far-ranging and rare mammals like in Florida, the Florida panther, for the most part, road mortality is having the greatest impact on reptiles and amphibians. 95% of all vertebrate roadkill is reptiles and amphibians. We don't see it as much, especially with the amphibians, because if you think about them, they're small, they're active at night, especially rainy nights when we are less active, and so we might not be out to see them. They're soft-bodied, so that means a few cars pass over and they're no longer recognizable as an animal on the road, unlike a deer. And they're also easily scavenged. So we might have hundreds of dead frogs on a road on a migration night in the spring, and by morning, there's almost no sign of them because they've been eaten by crows or foxes or barred owls or what have you. So it's kind of an invisible problem for many people, unless, like me, you go out on these rainy nights and walk along these roads and really see it. And the reason it's an issue for these spring migrating species is that because they have this explosive breeding event where large percentages of a local population are on the road all at the same time, it does not take a lot of cars to do a lot of damage. When I first started looking into this, I read some scientific papers and my jaw just dropped at the numbers that I was reading. So there was, in the mid-90s, a study in Canada that looked at just a 2-mile stretch of road over the course of 4 seasons. They documented more than 30,000 dead amphibians. Yeah, totally shocking to me too. In New York, they looked at a paved rural road, salamanders attempting to cross, and found 50 to 100% mortality. So the best case scenario there was that 1 out of every 2 made it across. There was another study in the Berkshires of Western Mass that looked specifically at spotted salamanders. They found lower mortality rates, around 25 to 30%, but calculated that even at that lower rate, within 25 years, local populations of those spotted salamanders would be gone, due solely to roadkill. So it's a bit of an invisible problem, but it's a real challenge for our local amphibian populations. And even though I'm mostly talking about my experiences down in Southwest New Hampshire, you all have the same species up here and the same concerns up here. So my organization started a project about 15 years ago. I've been at the head of it for 13 years now, where we train community volunteers to go out on these, what we call them, big nights, when there's lots of amphibians migrating. And we train them to identify road crossing hotspots, because remember, these animals are coming back to the same places year after year. So you can start to predict them. If you go out and look at the right time, you'll find them if they're there. We document by counting the amphibians by species and live versus dead. And then one of our other goals is to reduce road mortality by moving these animals across the road by hand or in buckets. The idea here is that we used to call it the salamander crossing guards, and I rebranded because crossing guards stop traffic. And we're not legally allowed to do that. But what we are doing is moving these animals faster than they can move themselves. And so this project is now long running, and we're not the only ones doing it. Up here, if this is of interest to you, you might check out the North Branch Nature Center. They're based in Montpelier, but they do coordinate amphibian crossing efforts, I think, all the way down to this neck of the woods. And if any of you came up from south, Bonnievale Environmental Education Center in Brattleboro, we modeled our project after theirs. They've been doing this for a very long time too. So there are groups of salamander people that are out there. And the way the project works is that folks come to a volunteer training. It's just an indoor slideshow. We talk about the migration. We talk about how to identify the different species you might see on the roads. We talk a lot about safety and how to be safe when you're out on a dark, wet road at night. That is the most important part of our volunteer training. And then folks are added to our email list, and they kind of wait for the conditions to be right. The migration is wholly weather-dependent phenomenon. So every year I get so many people calling me and saying, when will the salamanders migrate? And I can't tell you a date. I wish I could. It would be easier for all of us if I said April 12th, we'll be there. But instead, we have to watch the weather. So I'm refreshing the weather forecast 5 or 6 times a day in the season. And we have a 5-day salamander forecast on our website, so people can check it out, in which we kind of project if the weather looks good. And of course, because it's all local conditions, it's very often that in one part of our region we'll have a migration and not in another part. So the higher elevation areas hold on to their snowpack when there's snow, hold on to their snowpack longer and tend to have later migrations. Keene is in a valley, so it usually goes earliest because there's less snow there and warmer temperatures, but it's all weather dependent. So people kind of wait. and head out when they can to some of these sites. And over the years now, we've trained, I think, more than 1,200 people. Many of them come back year after year, just like the salamanders. This becomes a spring tradition for them. I've watched a number of kids kind of grow up one spring at a time, seeing them, I see them one time a year, they come out for the migration, and it's a pretty amazing community event. It's hard to describe what a powerful experience it can be to hold one of these animals in your hand for the very first time. So some people have never, how many of you have seen a spotted salamander in real life? Just a show of hands. Oh, many of you, awesome. So they're pretty impressive. They're 6 to 8 inches long, they're thicker than my thumb, they have bright yellow polka dots. And even though they're a common species, they spend 95% of their lives underground, really only emerging on these few nights a year in the spring for their migration. So many people have never seen one, even though they're living in our backyards, essentially. And so it can be a really powerful experience to see an animal up close for the very first time, to have permission to hold that animal and look at it closely, and to be doing something to help that animal on its journey. It's a really powerful experience that really captures the imaginations of many people. So we have a lot of volunteers who come back year after year. Last year we had about 250 people actively participating in the project in one way or another. And over that time we've identified approximately, well, I should say that in the beginning it was a small project. We had half a dozen sites in the greater Keene area. And as it started to grow in popularity, I was starting to get phone calls and emails from people from further away who said, I want to do this. This sounds great. I don't mind driving an hour and a half to get to Keene to help on these nights. And I thought, this is all wrong. The last thing that any of us should be doing on a rainy spring night is driving a great distance if we care about amphibians. Because how many have we inadvertently run over on our way to help the ones in Keene, right? So when that started to happen, we decentralized the project a bit. So we still have about 8 or 10 sites where we have a really kind of robust and structured and organized volunteer effort. And I'll talk about one of them in particular. But I also started to include in my training how to find crossings near you, and encouraging people to go out with their friends and neighbors and family members to their local sites. Don't come to Keene. Every person in this room probably has an amphibian crossing within 10 minutes of your house. These are common species, and if you've got a wooded hillside on one side of the road and a vernal pool or other wetland on the other side of the road, amphibians are moving across on spring nights. So I encourage people to go out and try to look in their neighborhoods. And so now we've got a map of about 80 crossing sites in 40 different towns. Some of them we know a lot about because we've had volunteers out there for 15 years in a row. And others we know very little about. Somebody went out one night, 1 year in 2008, and I threw it on the map because I thought, well, someone else probably lives in that town that wants to do this one day, and this will give them a starting point. So it's kind of across the board. But during that time, we've also provided safe passage for 50,000 amphibians, give or take a few. Those are the live ones, and some of them are the same. I should say it's 50,000 crossings, because some of these animals are coming back year after year. We're for sure moving some of the same animals across the road multiple times in that figure. So one thing that I often, people ask me about this project, every year I get questions, how are the salamanders doing? How's the population? How does this site compare to that site? And I have to say that I can't tell you that, because like any scientific endeavor, and especially citizen science projects, there are limits to our data. And really, this project is more stewardship than science in a lot of ways. We don't have rigorous, consistent data collection efforts that could result in a scientific paper, for instance. And part of the reason for that is because I want to encourage people to participate, and because we can't predict when a migration will happen, it makes it very difficult for people to commit to a project. And so what I say to folks is, who come to a training, come out, and when we have a migration night, come out if you can, stay as long as you like. So on some, it stands to reason, we've got some sites near population centers right in Keene where we might get easily 25 people or more in a night, and other sites where there's a couple, 2 people who are going out and looking. So stands to reason, even if you had the exact same number of amphibians at both sites, the site with more people is going to encounter more of the amphibians. Fewer of them are going to kind of sneak by unrecorded. We also, if there's a migration that's happening we basically are out there in the early evening hours from sundown till 10 or 11 or maybe midnight, and some people stay for half an hour and some people stay for 5 hours, and it all depends on your interest level and the amphibian activity and your tolerance for being out in a 43-degree rainstorm. So, you know, if the migration, if all the warm rains one year happen at 3 a.m., our counts for that year are very low. It doesn't mean there was no migration. It means it happened when we weren't awake to see it. And so there's a lot of variability in the data. And because of that, I can't really say from year to year or site to site, I can't make accurate comparisons. But I feel very firmly that the counts matter. And I'll give one example of that. That the numbers matter. And it's more than just stewardship, that the science piece is important. So in Keene, we have one site, North Lincoln Street. It's an interesting site. There's a wooded city park on one side of the road with a hillside. There's the road, and there's another property, and then right behind that property is a wetland. And at this site, it's a very concentrated crossing. It's about 1/10 of a mile wide. They're coming out of that wooded hillside, crossing the road through that property and into this wetland. And in 2008, the property across the road from the park and in between the road and the wetland was cleared. And there was a for sale sign that popped up on it. And this was the early days of the project. I think we'd only been collecting data for maybe 3 years. We were just getting going. And the Keene Conservation Commission was reviewing a permit request to develop that site, and they had to review it because it was close to a wetland, and so that triggered kind of this review. And one of them heard about the salamander people who had been going out on that site, and they wanted some more information, and so they called me up, they asked me to come in, and they said, how does this site compare to all the other sites? Can you tell us if it's important? And I said basically what I said to you folks just now. I can't tell you how it compares. Our data can't really say that. But this happened to be in April, and I said, what I can tell you is that the other night, 20 people were out there for 4 hours, and they moved 838 frogs across the road, and they were all going into that parcel. So those are numbers that really mean something. If I had said there's a lot of frogs, or even if I had said there are hundreds of frogs, that is not the same thing as saying 838 frogs in 4 hours. And by the way, 20 people who care enough about this to go out there in the pouring rain and move them off the road. And in that case, those numbers were compelling enough to the city that not only did they deny the permit request, they actually ended up purchasing that land as conservation land for the city because of its importance as a migratory amphibian pathway. And this is, I think, really is the power of citizen science. It was local information. It's not ever going to be put in a scientific paper. It's not rigorous enough for that, but it helped inform local decisions about conservation and land protection and wildlife protection in a way that big data can't always. And it also demonstrated the value having people come out and commit their time to this shows to decision makers that this matters to people in your community. That same site, 10 years later, starting in 2018, had something that to me was even way more exciting happen. And that is that the city came to the Harris Center. Well, really, a volunteer with our project approached the city and said, would you consider working with the Harris Center on a project to close this road to vehicle traffic on amphibian migration nights? This has never been done in New Hampshire before. There are places that do this. The places where it's done tend to be places like national forests and national parks where there's one landowner and one road with no one living on it, which makes it easier for them to control access to the road. So this was a really new thing, and it had to be brought before the city council. They had to discuss this. And I put the word out to our I should say actually, in 2008, I'm going to back up a little bit because there's another piece to this story. In 2008, one of our volunteers circulated a petition. He wanted salamander tunnels put in at North Lincoln Street. And he said, you know, they were putting in some speed humps to slow traffic. He said, perfect timing, let's put in salamander tunnels. And he circulated a petition and got enough people to sign it, and it came before City Council, and they asked me to come and speak to them about it. And I came to them, and salamander tunnels are a really great and effective solution for some places. There's some amazing ones that are just went in Moncton, Vermont a few years ago that are just wonderful and appropriate for some sites. They're very expensive. That Moncton project cost, I think, somewhere over $400,000 when all was said and done to put in 2 tunnels. And so what I said to the city of Keene was salamander tunnels are very expensive, and in this case it may not make the most sense to put them in a site where they're only going to be used a few nights a year by amphibians, and when this is a small city that doesn't have a lot of funds, but road closures are cheap. Yeah. So I pitched this to them, and I was alone in a room basically presenting to them, and they were very polite, and they smiled and they nodded, and they said, we'll give you some traffic cones to slow traffic a little bit. And that was the end of that. That was 2008. In 2018, one of our volunteers approached the Department of Public Works and said, I'd like you to consider this project. And so at those city council meetings, by then the project had grown dramatically in terms of number of volunteers and years of data. And so I put the word out to our salamander people, here's a chance to show up and voice your support for this project. And it was standing room only in that city council room. I wasn't there alone anymore. There were all these people, and I said, you don't even have to say anything, but show up in your reflective vest, which is what I insist that they wear when they're out on the roads at night, just to show that you're part of this and you're supporting this. And it was standing room only, and it was unanimously approved by the city council. And so in 2018, we had our very first amphibian road closures in Keene at North Lincoln Street. We still had, and something really amazing happened that I did not anticipate, which is I figured we'd still go out, we'd still have some volunteers that come out because we wanted to count how many amphibians had been provided safe passage by the road closures so that we could report out what the effects of this were. So I did my regular volunteer trainings, and again, we have dozens of other sites where people are going. This is just one of them. But we had our regular volunteer trainings, and I kind of expected, you know, the same 15 or 20 people to come out to that site and help me count, even though there was no traffic anymore. Those people ended up going to other sites where they felt it was more important for them to be to really prevent these animals from being hit. But the city, because it's the Department of Public Works and they're closing a road for the night, they had to get word out through their channels, social media and signs on the street and press releases, and a whole different audience paid attention to that. People who were not nature people, they weren't salamander people, they hadn't come to my training, they had no idea what to expect, but something interesting was happening in their neighborhood and they wanted to come check it out. And so on the first night I showed up and there were 50 people there who wanted to see the frogs. That site, we call it Salamander Crossing. That site has some salamanders, is largely frogs, wood frogs and peepers mostly. And it created a whole different vibe out there because there were people who had heard about this project but had young children and didn't feel safe bringing their kids out on roads at night. It's not inherently family friendly for certainly not for young kids in any way. Last year I had someone out there with a stroller. You know, it's changed the tenor. We've got toddlers out there, there's families, and people who never heard about this at all. Like we had to really change a lot of our messaging because basic things that I thought were common knowledge, like the migration happens after dark and in the rain, and you should bring a flashlight. Those were things that we had to kind of put out there through messaging because it was a whole new group of people but it's turned into a real community space and a real source of pride for that community. And in the meantime, at minimum of 35, we've counted in the 2 years 3,500 amphibians while we were there counting that made it across the road when the barricades were up. So, and we leave them up. We leave anywhere between 10 o'clock and midnight, depending on how many people are there, but the barricades stay up all night and the migration will continue all night if conditions are right. So it's really was amazing for me. I've been going to that site for a decade to be able, and every time I would worry about leaving, leaving them to their own defenses. There's not a lot of traffic at midnight or 2 in the morning, but it doesn't take a lot of traffic when there's hundreds of amphibians on the road. So it was such a remarkable feeling to be able to go home for the night and to know that they would be okay on their own through morning. And this coming spring, we just got approval for the 3rd year at that site, and now we're working on trying to expand it to a second crossing site. That one's hitting a few more bumps in the road because that's a road where there's more houses where people live. So that part's a slow process. But I feel very confident that if we hadn't been able to present those numbers, these projects wouldn't have happened. It might not be publishable data or big data, but the numbers tell a story that words can't tell. And in this case, it's a really compelling story for people in our communities. So I want to tell one other piece about an interesting side project, and then I'm sure there are questions. I was just trying to hit the most important points, but I could talk salamanders for a very long time. So I'm going to let you guys drive some of that conversation. But I want to mention one other project that is interesting. Some of you, especially if there's wildlife biologists in the room, I'm sure are familiar with the idea of mark recapture projects, where you capture an individual of a species, this is bird banding essentially, and you mark it in some way, let it go, and then see if you recapture it again, and it can tell you some information. So spotted salamanders, remarkably, have unique spot patterns. They're kind of like fingerprints. So the spots on the back of a spotted salamander are unique to that individual. They essentially form in that animal's first year of life. These animals, spotted salamanders, don't even start breeding until 2 to 5 years old. But you can take a picture of those spot patterns and then take pictures of animals you encounter in the future and tell whether you're seeing the same animal. So you don't actually have to mark it in any way. You don't have to do anything invasive. You just take its picture. And we started an experiment at this North Lincoln Street site that we expanded to other sites, where we started, that site is mostly frogs. So we could have 1,000 amphibians on a night, and 960 of them will be frogs. So we don't have a lot of salamanders, which makes it very easy for us to photograph all the salamanders that we encounter. And so we started a kind of a spot pattern database to start to see, are we seeing the same individuals again at these sites? How are these sites where they have to cross roads, how might this be affecting them? And we're still kind of in the early stages. We did an experimental year at that North Lincoln Street site in 2014. We've expanded it to a few other sites since then. But we've already encountered 31 salamanders at North Lincoln Street that we've seen on at least 2 occasions, individuals. Wow. There's one, I was so disappointed because we didn't see him last year, but we saw him 5 years in a row, the first 5 years. And the last year, that 5th year, was really remarkable because everyone was gone. I was packing up to leave for the night. I was in my car, I was driving away, and I always, of course, drive 3 miles an hour through these sites so that I can hop out of my car and move animals off if I need to. And I was getting ready to leave, and a salamander stepped in front of my car, and I hustled out, I moved it across the street, I took his picture real quick, and it turns out that was the 5th year of that individual who appeared to me. But last year would have been his 6th year, we didn't see him. But we've had some individuals that we photographed in 2014 that we saw again in 2019 and not in between, so we missed them. That means they must have moved later at night or didn't migrate that year. But it's a really interesting project, and maybe over time we'll have enough data to really say something. Right now we're kind of just taking pictures and seeing what happens, but we have now 3 crossing sites where we've had at least 1 repeat customer for salamanders, and that North Lincoln Street site is the most impressive one because I think we photograph a large percentage of the salamanders that are on that road. Our other sites where we have hundreds of salamanders in a night, it's just not feasible to photograph them all, especially when those roads are open to traffic and people are really trying to move them across quickly. But the sites where there's fewer salamanders, it's a really interesting, to me, way of looking at them and seeing about longevity. I'm on a vernal pool listserv where people who are interested in amphibians all throughout the Northeast kind of chime in and have conversations. There's a fellow, I think he's in Pennsylvania. He's got a breeding pool on his property, and he's been photographing the salamanders there. And last year he wrote in with one that he first photographed 14 years before. I know, it's astounding. I think we tend to think of these as, and some amphibians are short-lived, but not all of them. And it really makes you think about what the impact is of the loss of an individual even for these populations. So everyone who's out, most of them who are out on the roads on these nights are breeding adults. And that's another reason that road mortality is a concern, because for spotted salamanders, 2 to 5 years to reproductive maturity. And they're also breeding in, for the most part, in vernal pools, which for those of you who don't know are depressions in the forest floor. They fill with melting snow and spring rain, and they tend to dry up by late summer or fall. That's fantastic for the amphibians who've adapted to them, because it means fish can't live there, and fish are predators of amphibian eggs and amphibian larvae. But there's a race against time, and so if you have a really dry year or a really hot year, that pool might dry up earlier than usual. And if you probably all know or remember that amphibians have this kind of miraculous life cycle, at least these ones, where they start off as eggs in water. For the vernal pool species, those eggs can hatch in anywhere from 10 days to 2 months. Then they've got a period as a larvae where they have gills for breathing in water. They have tails but no legs. And so they need to grow lungs and legs and get out before that pool dries up in order to be ready for life on land. And so if we have a heat wave or a dry year, climate change is a big question here in terms of vernal pool, how long they'll be able to hold water. You can have kind of mass breeding failure for these species that year. Now, they're adapted to these really volatile systems, and so the way that they adapt is that they are long-lived and they come back year after year to replace themselves. But if they're getting hit by cars on the way, then that kind of breaks that equation. So, I think we're really just starting to understand road mortality and the role that it plays in the lives of a lot of wildlife species. But this project and others like it throughout the region are really starting to get at that, and also to raise awareness of, if you don't have to drive on a 45-degree raining night in April, if your errand can wait till the morning, just wait, And 1,200 volunteers that we've trained, some of them go out once and say, this is not for me. I am freezing and I'm wet and I don't like this. But they remember on those rainy nights, they think, maybe I won't drive tonight, And that, I think, is also one of the kind of outcomes of this that is hard to quantify but valuable. So I have lots of things I can share, but those were the really important points I wanted to share with you. So I'm hoping that there are questions and I can help to answer them. So I'll start with here.
Hi. One of the things we have on our property, 3 vernal pools that have been mapped by the Vermont people, and so we've been into it for quite a while. But one of the
Could you speak louder?
Yeah, we have 3 vernal pools on our property in Vermont, and they have been mapped and certified, and people have been out. One of the things that we got our local church to do, and this is a big deal. Rob Grable, he's the assistant pastor. He takes the children out, the high schoolers in particular, and he has organized this for many, many years. And they go on that one night out in the rain. He warns them, he gives them training, because I'm sure he had some training.
I've heard of him. I've heard that he does this, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he is fabulous. He's also the soccer coach at Hanover High. A plug for him. But, the thing is, he has gotten our youth in our church so involved in this and preserving the salamanders and tree frogs that it's part of their curriculum in Sunday school. Wow. And it's not a bad idea.
It's a great idea. We often get questions from people who say, bring this to our schools, and it is challenging in an organized way to bring to an actual school because it's unpredictable and it happens at night, and so we really need parents to be involved. So more often families are involved in that. Parents and upper elementary school, middle school, or high school kids will come to a training and then go out and do this together. And that's it. For us, we found it works more in a kind of a grassroots way like that than with actual full groups of Girl Scouts or school groups, but it is a really amazing experience to be part of. And I want to mention, you said on that one big night, I always tell people, there's a real mythology around big night, and that, the mythology is that, we've got this, there's this whole myth around it that we've had this long winter, and, we've all been waiting for spring, and so have all the frogs and salamanders, and then one day it starts to rain, and it rains throughout the night, and on that one big night, all of the spotted salamanders and wood frogs and peepers, they all kind of clamber up from their burrows and move across the landscape on one big night. And I have never seen that happen on one big night. It is more often 2 or 3 big nights, a handful of medium nights, a small night here or there. It's a series of nights. So if you missed it, you didn't probably miss it. There's probably still a chance, unless you're really into May, and then maybe you did miss it. But it's something that we hear a lot, and people talk about big night as though it's just the one, and there's always more than one. I see it. There's a hand in the back, and then I'll come up front. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to make that point too, because I've gone out for about 10 years, just below my house on Union Village Road, and I've gotten another family involved, and I sort of didn't want a whole lot of people, because it's not one of those ones where you see 100 at once. But what I want to say is, yes, you think it's going to be a big night, but then it lasts the next rain and the next rain and the next rain. There's always more. And the other thing I want to say is they come back again from the vernal pool, but not in such a mass.
That's right.
And I've seen them coming back and going over in the same night.
Yes.
So, and then I think, well, which way was this salamander going?
Yeah.
And so I figure out which way they were going.
Yeah.
They're very determined, and I take them and put them on that side of the road, because some are coming back from the vernal pool.
Right.
So it's not easy, really.
Right. You've hit on a few points. It's a few important points. One is we always instruct people to move them in the direction they're headed, even if it seems counterintuitive to you, because they know where they want to go, and they'll just turn themselves right around if you put them where you think they should go. Another is that, yes, there are nights when you'll have them going in both directions. Our program is really focused mostly on the inbound migration, and that's because it happens in the largest numbers and is easiest to predict, and different species spend different lengths of time in the pool. Some spotted salamanders can be in those pools for a month or more, and so we can't, and they kind of trickle out on rainy nights into the summer. And the reality is that any rainy night in the summer, there are green frogs and bullfrogs and pickerel frogs and two-line salamanders and redback salamanders and all these other species that are out and about. And we kind of have to say it ends here, but it doesn't really end. But the breeding migration does. And also some of these species, so wood frogs and spring peepers, you may or may not know, have a really miraculous survival strategy for winter, which is that they freeze solid. Their heart stops beating, their lungs stop breathing. They kind of produce a cryoprotectant, an antifreeze to protect their internal organs. And so they spend winter in a state of suspended animation, essentially frozen. And as a result, they can overwinter very close to the surface of the forest floor. So wood frogs, telemetry studies have shown that they're anywhere from 1.5 inches to 4 inches deep only. Wow. So spotted salamanders cannot survive freezing. So they have to go to follow burrows down below the freeze line. What this means for us in the spring is that wood frogs and spring peepers are typically the first to emerge, and on the very first nights of the migration, we mostly see wood frogs and peepers. And spotted salamanders come a little later, and then you might have, and the wood frogs only stay in the pool sometimes just a few nights if conditions are good, or a few weeks. They don't stay very long. So we often see them coming out. The spotted salamanders, we capture maybe about half of them on their outbound migration, and the others linger too long for us to really encounter, because this is a very exciting event and people are really excited, but by the time we get to early or mid-May, volunteer interest is waning at that point, and people have other things they want to do, and so we've already been out on 6 nights, so we tend to wrap up at that point. And then unfortunately what that means is that the young of the year are really left to their own devices, because they're not coming out of those pools until summer, end of the summer. And that's a question about, it's concentrated, so it's harder to get folks together to experience it and see it and help with it. Although there are programs that do that. There's a program in Philadelphia, the Toad Detour, where there's a reservoir in a neighborhood in Philly where these toads breed. They come out of a protected parkland and across the road in the early part of the year, and then later in the summer the young ones come across, and they do have volunteers that go out and move the wee ones, but we don't. So in our program anyway. Did you have a?
You mentioned that they can travel about a quarter of a mile, is that right?
Yeah, a quarter of a mile or less, yeah.
And so, do they tend to go to the same place after their breeding, or could they go just anywhere?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to it. I think, it depends on the landscape a lot. So if you've got protected woods and a wetland and then everything else is developed, they're of course going back to those same woods. If you have more available habitat for them, I'm not sure.
Well, we have, our property is next to the Appalachian Trail on a ridge, and so it's quite wooded.
Yeah.
So a quarter of a mile may not be where there is a road.
Right. In places like that, it's wonderful. They don't have to worry about roads.
What's the question?
The question was, do they go back? They migrate toward the pool, but then when they go back, so they're going back to the same breeding pools year after year, or they're going back to the same wintering and kind of summer and fall habitat year after year. And I'm not 100% sure about that. Yeah.
So I just wonder about the logistics of getting a good count. So each individual volunteer is keeping a tally?
Yes.
And then you just bring all the tallies together at the end of the evening?
Yeah, so some of our sites, we have what are called site coordinators. These are kind of our special go-to volunteers who come out with data forms and cross signs that are twice the size of this and full of reflective tape. And those folks hand out data forms, and everyone keeps their own tally and then returns them to the site coordinator at the end of the night, and then they get them to me. People who are at sites that are just in their town, they keep their own tallies and email. Well, actually, we're moving this year finally away from email because it's crazy to get emails from 50 different people after a migration night. We're going to move to a web-based form. But yes, people keep their own count, and we have data forms on our website that they can download and print out, and we also hand them out at our trainings on Right in the Rain paper, which is special waxy paper that won't fall apart in a rainstorm. So that's kind of how, and then basically we tell, usually people work in teams, so one person is moving the animals across and another person's keeping the tallies. It works best that way, especially if there's a lot of critters on the road, to work in teams like that. Over there, I guess underneath the painting.
So if you're trying to identify a new crossing site that you want to protect,
Yeah.
what would be the description of the site? So a wooded.
Yeah, so like what are you looking for to try to predict?
Toward a vernal pool.
Yes.
Across a road.
So yeah, like the question is, if you want to figure out where there are crossing sites in your town, what do you look for on the landscape?
Yeah.
Basically roads near water, but in a classic sense, yeah, you'll have a wooded hillside on one side of the road, and then a vernal pool or other kind of wetland on the other side of the road. Those are our classic sites that we see for these species, but also any road near water in the summer, near a wetland, near a lake, near a pond, near a stream, will have frogs on it on a rainy summer night. So roads near water are the big factor, but in the early spring migration, also a wooded hillside that helps. Yeah.
So often driving down the roads at that time of year, you can audibly hear the peepers.
Yes.
Is that a mental note that would help answer?
Yes,
that
that's one of the things I tell people to do is to go out when conditions are right and to drive very slowly with the windows down and to listen for peepers and also wood frogs who call for a much shorter period of time. Peepers are they might breed in vernal pools, but they'll breed in all kinds of wetlands, so they're not necessarily, they are early migrating species, but if you're looking for vernal pools, wood frogs are the thing, and they sound like quacking ducks for a short window of time, just a week or two, and that's another way to find it is by ear. For sure. And I should say, as you I'm sure all know, the peepers and the wood frogs will chorus like that even if it's not a migration night. Right. Once they get there, they start singing. So that's just a way of finding where the breeding wetlands are. Yeah.
Yeah, we have ponds with eastern spotted newts, so we don't get the necessary migration patterns as much because the adults stay in those ponds
Yes.
year after year. But we don't have the red F system in our particular area as we did in southern Connecticut. So I'm not sure exactly what the,
There's got to be Fs there somewhere.
I know.
Because they're the juvenile form of those adult newts that you're
Yeah,
seeing. So
but-
somewhere they're around, but
They must be.
yeah.
It's not a conifer situation, and in Connecticut, that was what it was, really characteristic of that species, but, yeah, so we have those, and, but also we have a lot of other vernal pools around with the red spotted,
With the newts in them.
yellow spotted salmon.
Oh, the yellow spotted, yep.
Yeah, and they are very, very active, and, we see them constantly, and, but the migrations, not so much across roads.
That's great.
Right where we are, yeah.
That's fantastic. If you have a spot where they don't need to cross a road, that's fantastic. And that's a really good argument for land protection in one way or another, to be able to ensure places where these animals can move freely throughout all of their habitat needs without having to encounter cars or infrastructure that, so it's wonderful when that happens. I spend so much of my time on these roads that I kind of get in this like search image of I see wildlife on roads, dead or alive, often dead. And when I can go to a protected land and see a vernal pool where all the animals breeding in there didn't have to cross a road, it's such a breath of fresh air for me to say, like, here they get to just live out their life cycle and not have this as a worry, Did you have a...
Do you know of somebody in this area who sort of is like you, that knows the big, areas where the big crossings are, that coordinates, and where somebody from this area could be trained to go out on the big night?
Yeah, I don't know, does Vermont Eco Studies do anything with road crossings?
Not as much road crossings. We do more with vernal pool monitoring. That being said, I'm coordinating our vernal pool program for the spring, and I'm more than happy if you reach out to me. I'll give you an idea of time periods, because they really do differ from state to state, from Champlain Valley to Northeast Kingdom. The time is going to differ as the temperature does, so I'm more than happy to give you some tips or some ideas of where you can look for the crossings.
And do you do training?
Quick plug. BPMON at btecostudies.org.
I would also add the North Branch Nature Center. They also do actual road crossing. They've done a predictive model, which is probably based on some of your vernal pool data, where they've predicted a bunch of sites that they think could be road crossings, and they're looking for people to go out and kind of ground truth them. So go out on these nights and walk along them and collect information and share it with them. I don't know if they have official in-person trainings. They might, but they do have training modules on their website. So you could go to their website and it'll tell you some of the important stuff. And you're also welcome, the Harris Center website, if you just want some information about like how do I stay safe on a road when I'm going out and doing this, how to identify species, we have a volunteer handbook and different kind of tip sheets on our website that you could use to start. But I would check in with Vermont Eco Studies and also the North Branch Nature Center on road crossings. They're based out of Montpelier, but I just looked at their map knowing I was coming here, and they've got a few sites that are pretty close to here that they work in a wide region on this. So I don't know, you might not want to travel there for a training, but their online stuff might be enough.
Just in addition to that, VC is also currently working on a vernal pool atlas to try and atlas the location of vernal pools across the state. We have a little more than 5,000 currently atlased right now. We're currently working on a public release so others can add their vernal pool locations to the sighting. That's hopefully going to be released within the next couple of months. And at that point, you can go online and be like, okay, where's my house? Like, oh, there's a known vernal pool here, here, and here.
Yeah.
And then you can kind of look and see which ones have major road crossings near them and kind of prioritize where you might go and investigate where the larger road crossings are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could maybe make an argument for a study at least where you would actually relocate some of these captured amphibians, and since we have so many protected sites, to see whether or not they would benefit from some kind of
For being away from roads.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. So, I don't know if everyone could hear it. She was asking if there's a value in looking at relocation. One, there might be. One thing that is a concern in the amphibian world is the spread of disease. Amphibians are extremely susceptible to a number of pathogens that are kind of really in southern places are really decimating amphibian populations. So in general, it's not advised to move animals from one place to another because you might be inadvertently spreading disease. We, because of our colder winters, but maybe not so much anymore, have been mostly protected from the impacts of these pathogens, but it's coming in our future, and so that would be a hesitation I would have about those kinds of projects, is that you might be inadvertently bringing another threat in without meaning to. So I don't know if anyone's done it, but that would be a concern I'd have. Yeah. I see someone all the way in the back. Yeah.
Amphibians, how do you do it? Just pick them up and carry them across?
Yeah, you just pick them up. I hear all the time, like, oh, but the oils on my hand will hurt them. That's a really common myth. And yes, they have sensitive skin. They have porous skin. They're very sensitive to toxins. And so we instruct people that you shouldn't have anything that could be a toxin on your hands. And what I mean by that is perfume, lotion, bug spray, anything like that. Basically clean, wet hands, and you pick them up, usually across their midsection. You do not pick them up by their tails or their legs, because that can hurt them. You just kind of have a firm, you don't want to squeeze too hard, obviously, but you just have a firm grip around their middle and kind of move them across. And then really busy sites, people bring buckets and put a bunch in a bucket at once and then kind of gently tip it on the other side of the road. My answer also when people say, well, my hands hurt them, is flippant but true, that your hands are a lot less damaging than a car tire. So if you're moving them across quickly, that to me is better than leaving them to their devices, unless they're moving themselves across very quickly and there's clearly no cars in sight, and sometimes we just let them cross themselves and keep count. But it's basically picking them up gently. What's that?
Did you use a snow shovel?
I think that would be tough. Some people use spatulas to remove the dead because they don't want to touch them, and they kind of flick them off the road. Because we ask people, if you count the dead ones, to please remove them so that we're not counting the same dead frog 5 times and thinking that there's 5 dead frogs. These animals in the early spring are sort of sluggish and cold because they're ectotherms, they're cold-blooded, and so reliant on ambient air temperature. But as you get further in the season, they hop. The frogs are pretty spry, and they hop right off a shovel. They wouldn't stay on. And the spring peepers, as you probably know, are the size of the tip of my thumb. So it would be really hard to pick them up with a tool, I think. Yep.
Just in terms of efficiency, an awful lot of the vernal pools in rural Vermont and New Hampshire have a 180-degree access to woods.
Yeah.
And the other half has a road.
Right.
I would think in the long term, those who want to winter on the other side of the road are going to be a diminishing population.
You're probably right, yes.
Is it really worthwhile to deal with that vernal pool?
It's an interesting question, I guess it's kind of like an ethical question in some way. I will say that most of the places that we go, that's not the scenario. I mean, there's woods on one side and not on the other. Most of the crossings that I'm familiar with, that option doesn't exist. I'm sure that's true in some crossings, and probably over time you're right, because even when we have people out there, we don't cross every animal. We're not out there all night. If there's a ton of them, we're doing what we can, but we're not hand carrying frogs across the road is not the solution to this problem. The solution is things like road closures and tunnels and infrastructure, but you can't figure out where to properly site those and where to put your energy into creating those other more permanent solutions until you have the data to support it. So I'm not advocating that we should be out there hand moving amphibians across every road every spring from now until eternity, but I think that in order to figure out where road closures make sense, where tunnels make sense, you need some of this data, and you might as well be helping them while you're out there, rather than leaving them just counting, Sure.
This is a little off the subject, but in the middle of the summer, in a warm rain, you'll be driving down a road in Hanover that's paved, and there'll be frogs all over the road. And we live on a dirt road, and we'll be going home at night, in July.
Yeah.
And there'll be frogs all over the road. And
Yeah.
my poor husband, I'm going left, right,
Yeah.
stop, left, right. No, there's one, stop, no, there's another.
Yeah.
What are they, they're not migrating, are they just out, they say sometimes the road is warm from the sun?
I mean, my poor husband does the same thing, except I make him stop the car so I can get out and move him across the road, and it takes us forever to get anywhere. They're dispersing, some of them, like they're coming out to feed. So I've come across toads that are, you know, feeding on worms right in the middle of the road. So that some of them are maybe dispersing to new sites. Some of them maybe just be out there feeding, foraging. It's a nice night to be out and about if you're a frog in the summer when it's warm and rainy. So it's just kind of general movement.
Can I
Yeah.
mention something about
Yeah.
that as well? When you think about like the lag period between spring migration, egg laying, and then the eggs hatching, what I've also encountered is you'll have a big surge of movement during the spring when things are moving for breeding. There'll be a lag period while things aren't breeding and there's nothing hatching. And then toward the end of the summer when things start hatching, you start seeing the movement across the roads,
Yeah.
things dispersing from their ponds to up hills.
Right.
So it could also be that there's that lag period between not seeing anything and then suddenly see everything because everything is immediately hatching.
Okay.
Right, the young are moving up to uplands, and some of these, yeah, and a lot of these animals are overwintering in uplands and forests and need to move there at some point too. Did you have a question? You had your hand up before. Yeah.
Yeah. You recommended road closures as opposed to just getting teams out there to move the amphibians.
Mm-hmm.
We have a conservation commission in Hartford, and road closures might be too soon for this spring.
Yeah.
But next spring, in theory, we could start the road closures. And
Yeah.
this
Do you know of a site where you know there's numbers of amphibians? Like, do you have a site in mind?
I have at least 2.
Yeah.
But if we all did the just going out and sweeping them up this year, next year we could have the road closures.
You could if your town is open to that. I mean,
If we
some
write
people,
emails.
you know, what'd you say?
If we write emails.
Yeah, I mean, you need, I think the reason that in 2018 said, no thank you, and 2018 they said, let's try it, is because there was a lot more community support, and we also had years of data. I don't think you need 10 years of data to get moving on this, but you definitely want 1 or 2 to show that it's not just a dozen frogs we're talking about here. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds. And also to start to figure out the timing of it for your particular site. I mean, you're looking at weather conditions, but it would be that's helpful information. I also would say, every little towns might be different, but if there's a road agent or a DPW and also police in your town, those are people you want to talk to ahead of time and talk about detours with them and get their buy-in and their input before you bring it out to the public, because otherwise you set up a situation where there could be conflict, and it's better to work it out ahead of time if you can, at least what the details of a detour might be. How can people get around? What about emergency vehicles? That kind of thing, yeah.
Is there an articulated plan for how to get your community to care and to do stuff about this?
I don't know of one, a plan for how to get your community involved. I mean, I do have materials that are start your own crossing brigade materials, like a training PowerPoint that I'm always happy to share, and a volunteer handbook that you can adapt to your own needs and that kind of thing. So I'm always happy to share those, and you can kind of find me anywhere on the Harris Center website. But you know, I leave it to the activist folks to talk about the community engagement piece or to work on that. Okay. Sounds like you have.
I'm kind of curious about the effectiveness of manually moving individuals across the road versus a tunnel.
Tunnels are way more effective, 100%,
Yeah.
with fencing to guide them.
I guess this is my other kind of question, and like at the same time, the financial side of it, whereas we have our one Moncton site, which is fantastic.
Right.
It can act year-round as a wildlife corridor under the road for mammals, whatever, in the winter as well. But it costs a ton.
Right.
And if you kind of compare the effectiveness of like a brigade of people for 4 hours moving everything across or close everything across versus a tunnel that's there year-round that doesn't have the same level of effectiveness. Like how do you weigh like the financial versus the conservation angle of it?
That's a decision for every community to make, really. The Moncton site has rare species, and it has very high numbers. They're talking thousands and thousands of salamanders at that site, including a high diversity and a high number of rare species. And, we might be moving them for 4 hours. They're migrating for another 8 hours when we're not out there. Mm-hmm. So, yes, traffic is quieter at 2 a.m., but you're still going to have mortality, whereas if you have a well-designed tunnel and fencing system, that really eliminates the mortality, but right, it's very expensive. And so some sites it's not appropriate for sure. And every town and community kind of has to look at the cost benefit for themselves and see what makes sense. Tunnels are not appropriate for every site. They clearly are not. But they are more effective than hand-carrying animals.
I can remember one of the first tunnels that I knew about was in Amherst, Mass.
Yes, that's like the Amherst, Mass salamander tunnels are world famous in herpetological circles. They were the first ones in North America. Yes, and a lot of experiment and design went into getting them to be a place that salamanders would move through. Yeah. They're still there. You can go visit them. I went and saw them a couple of years ago. They really found that for those they had to have grates on the tunnels to allow rain and ambient light to come in, that the animals wouldn't move through a dry tunnel with no ambient light. So, and they also needed fencing, because otherwise why would an animal go to a tunnel when they can just walk straight across? So the fencing kind of guides them to the tunnel. And so every year there's volunteers in Amherst that go out and they clean out the tunnel from debris and they repair the fencing for spring and get it ready to go. And they're effective, but they're not, there's maintenance, there's maintenance involved. I see a hand way in the back.
So they primarily nocturnal, because when I'm out in the woods after a night rain, there's tons of salamanders.
They're bright orange?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the salamander, most people, when I say I work with salamanders, everybody assumes I'm talking about those guys, because those are the ones that we are most familiar with, because they are one of the only diurnal, day-active species. Those red Fs are active in the daytime. Most of the rest of the, and bullfrogs and green frogs and such are also day active, but all of these migrating species are largely nocturnal. I do see wood frogs and peepers hopping around in the woods in the summer in the daytime, but during migration they're night active mostly. And those red Fs are not very active at night. We see very few of them at road crossings.
They're orange.
They're bright orange. They're called red Fs. I mean, yes. Did I answer all the questions?
One more question?
How do they navigate? How do they know do they smell the water, or?
How do they navigate is a really good question, and we don't really know the answer to that. There's some, so salamanders, so frogs, as you probably know, communicate largely through sound, especially around courtship. So those spring peepers you're hearing, those are male spring peepers singing, establishing territories, hoping females will find their way to them. So frogs are very sound-oriented. Salamanders don't have the ability to make sound, and they largely they communicate largely through scent. And so there's some thought that they can smell their pool and find their way, and that some of the ones who are early moving, the males tend to migrate first, and the females follow. And so there's some thought that there's scent trails or pheromones that are left behind. There was also some folks who thought they navigated more through what is it like? Through the stars, magnetic stuff. There's some. Not seeing stars, but just more of a geomagnetic fields. I don't know much about that. There's some research into that. Yeah. Is there time? I don't know. I'm leaving to you because I don't know what time it is.
All crowd around Brett. She'll have no choice but to answer your additional questions.
Okay.
Fair enough. See some more hands, but in the interest of letting people go home, we'll wrap it up.
Great.
Thank you tremendously for coming.